The sound of laughter echoed through the showroom, loud and mocking. A poor man, dressed in worn clothes, stood before an expensive car, his eyes gleaming with hope. He had worked tirelessly, scraped every penny, and dreamed of owning a car like this. But when the guard saw him, a smirk curled on his lips. "What do you think you're doing here?" he scoffed, eyeing the man from head to toe. Little did he know, this interaction would change both their lives in an instant. How could a single moment of judgment unravel everything they thought they knew? In the heart of a bustling city, the grandeur of a luxury car dealership stood in a stark contrast to the poverty-stricken streets that surrounded it. Bright, shiny vehicles, each more expensive than the last, gleamed under the pristine lighting of the showroom. The floors were polished, and the air was thick with the scent of new leather and success. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, and the salespeople stood at attention, dressed in sleek suits, waiting for their next commission. It was a world that most people only dreamed of stepping into, a world where wealth and status reigned supreme. And then there was Ethan. Ethan's clothes were far from the polished attire of the people who typically wandered through the dealership's doors. His jeans were frayed at the edges, his sneakers had seen better days, and his jacket, though warm, was faded from years of use. But in his eyes there was something different, a glimmer of determination, a sense of purpose. For Ethan, this was not just a showroom. This was the future he had been working toward for so long. Ethan had been saving for this moment for years, working long hours as a mechanic, doing odd jobs around the city, living frugally, and sacrificing almost everything to get here. Every dollar he earned was a step closer to realizing his dream of owning a car. It wasn't just about the vehicle itself. It was about proving to himself that he could make it, that he was worthy of something more than the life he had been handed. Today, he was going to test whether his dreams could finally become a reality. As he walked through the gleaming doors, the contrast between him and the lavish cars on display couldn't have been more stark. His heart raced, but he refused to be intimidated. He had worked for this moment, and no amount of judgment was going to stop him. The guard, a man named Greg, watched from his post near the entrance. Greg had worked at the dealership for years. His job simple: ensure only those who belonged in the showroom made it inside. His uniform, perfectly pressed and polished, fit the role he had been cast in, the gatekeeper to a world that excluded the less fortunate. To Greg, it was just another day, and another person who wasn't quite right for the space he guarded. When Greg saw Ethan walking toward the luxury cars, he couldn't help but chuckle. It was the kind of laugh that made people uncomfortable, a laugh laced with judgment and superiority. He had seen people like Ethan before, those who didn't belong, who didn't have the means or the status to even dream of owning a car like one of these. Greg had no idea who Ethan was or what he had been through. All he saw was a man who didn't belong. The showroom's glass doors swung open, and Ethan stepped inside, eyes wide with awe. The moment he crossed the threshold, Greg's laughter rang out, harsh and unforgiving. "Hey, buddy," Greg called, stepping forward with a smirk. "This isn't a place for people like you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he stood tall, refusing to let the insult tear him down. He had been insulted before, but this time, it felt different. This time he was determined to prove something, not to Greg, but to himself. Ethan clenched his fists, steadying himself against the guard's condescending glare. He had anticipated some skepticism. He didn't exactly look like the typical customer in this dealership, but the outright mockery stung more than he expected. Greg folded his arms and tilted his head, smirking. "Let me guess, you're just here to look around? Maybe snap a few pictures for social media and dream a little?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. Ethan took a deep breath. He wouldn't let this man intimidate him. "Actually, I'm here to buy a car." The laughter that erupted from Greg was loud, sharp, and unrestrained. A couple of salespeople turned their heads, curiosity flashing across their faces. Some chuckled along, while others simply returned to their business. "Oh, that's a good one," Greg said, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. "And what exactly are you planning to pay with? Loose change?" Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. It was a bank statement, evidence of years of hard work and saving. He held it out toward Greg. "I have enough," he said firmly. Greg snatched the paper, still grinning. But as his eyes scanned the numbers, the smirk faltered. His grip on the page tightened slightly, and his face paled. Ethan had more than enough to afford one of the luxury models. Before Greg could react, another voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Both men turned to see a well-dressed salesman approaching. His name tag read Marcus. Unlike Greg, Marcus exuded professionalism. He was in his mid-40s, wearing an elegant gray suit, and had an air of experience about him. "No problem," Greg said quickly, crumpling Ethan's paper and shoving it back toward him. "Just keeping the floor clear of, people who waste our time." Marcus raised an eyebrow and then turned to Ethan. "Sir, are you interested in purchasing a vehicle?" "Yes," Ethan said confidently, pocketing the paper. "I've been saving for years, and today I'm finally ready." Greg scoffed but said nothing. Marcus, sensing the tension, gestured for Ethan to follow him. "Right this way, sir." Ethan shot Greg a final glance before walking past him. The guard's eyes were filled with disbelief and something else, annoyance. Marcus led Ethan toward a sleek, midnight black luxury sedan. "This model has top-tier performance, leather interiors, and a smooth drive. It's one of our best." Ethan ran his fingers across the polished surface, feeling the cool metal beneath his touch. It was real. His dream was becoming a reality. "I'd love to test drive it," Ethan said. Marcus nodded. "Absolutely, let's—" "Wait a minute," Greg interjected, stepping between them. "Marcus, you can't be serious." Marcus frowned. "And why not?" Greg crossed his arms. "People like him don't just walk in and buy a car like this. You know as well as I do that he's probably going to waste our time." Ethan's jaw clenched. He had worked too hard to be dismissed like this. Before Marcus could speak, another voice joined in. "He's right." Ethan turned, expecting to see another guard. But instead, it was Ryan, one of the top salesmen in the dealership. Ryan was young, ambitious, and always on the lookout for high-profile clients. To him, Ethan was not a priority. "Marcus," Ryan continued, "we have a real customer coming in soon, a businessman looking to buy 2 cars. We shouldn't waste time on someone who," he gestured vaguely at Ethan, "clearly doesn't belong." Ethan felt a wave of anger rise within him. He wasn't going to let them reduce him to nothing. Before Marcus could respond, Ethan spoke up. "I have the money," he said firmly. "I worked for years to be here, and just because I don't look the part doesn't mean I don't belong." Ryan let out a small laugh. "That's a cute speech, but let's be honest." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "People like you never actually follow through." Ethan's heart pounded, and then a voice from behind them sent a chill down the air. "Is that so?" Everyone turned. Standing near the entrance was an older man in an expensive suit. His presence alone commanded respect. It was Mr. Harrington, the owner of the dealership. Mr. Harrington walked forward, his gaze settling on Greg, Ryan, and finally Ethan. His sharp eyes seemed to take in everything at once. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said calmly, "and I'd like to know, what exactly makes you think this man doesn't belong?" Greg hesitated. "Well, sir, he just doesn't look like a serious buyer." Ryan nodded quickly. "We were just trying to be efficient with our time, Mr. Harrington. We have high-profile clients coming in, and—" Mr. Harrington raised a hand, silencing him. Then he turned to Ethan. "What's your name, son?" Ethan met his gaze. "Ethan Parker." Mr. Harrington studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I knew an Ethan Parker once," he said. "A young mechanic who used to help out in my shop years ago. Hard-working kid, always dreaming about cars." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "I was that kid," he said softly. A flicker of recognition crossed Mr. Harrington's face, and then his smile widened. "Well, well," he chuckled. "It seems you've come a long way." Greg and Ryan exchanged nervous glances. Mr. Harrington turned to Marcus. "Did you treat this young man with respect?" Marcus straightened. "Yes, sir. I was just about to arrange a test drive." "Good." Mr. Harrington's smile faded as he looked at Greg and Ryan. "And what about you two?" Greg swallowed hard. I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to keep the showroom in order." Ryan fidgeted. "I thought we were just prioritizing bigger clients." Mr. Harrington let out a slow breath, then turned back to Ethan. "Son, I owe you an apology on behalf of my staff. I can assure you, this is not how we treat our customers." Ethan nodded, but he could see the tension in Greg's and Ryan's faces. And then Mr. Harrington said something that shocked everyone. "In fact, 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐿," he continued, "I think it's only fair that Ethan here gets the VIP treatment." Greg's face turned pale. Ryan's jaw dropped. And Ethan? For the first time since stepping into the showroom, he felt a deep sense of justice. Mr. Harrington personally guided Ethan through the process. Not only did Ethan get to test drive the luxury sedan, but he was treated with the utmost respect by the rest of the staff, who now scrambled to undo their mistakes. When Ethan finally sat down to sign the paperwork, he saw Greg and Ryan watching from a distance. Their arrogance had vanished, replaced with discomfort. As Ethan finalized the deal, Mr. Harrington turned to Greg and Ryan. "I don't tolerate discrimination in my business," he said firmly, "and I certainly don't tolerate people judging others by their appearance." Greg lowered his gaze. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear. Mr. Harrington then looked at Ethan. "I hope this experience doesn't sour your love for cars." Ethan smiled. "If anything, it's reminded me why I worked so hard in the first place." And with that, he took the keys to his new car. As he walked past Greg, he paused. "Next time," Ethan said, "maybe don't judge someone by their clothes." Greg didn't respond. Ethan turned, stepped into his car, and drove off. And Greg, for the first time in his career, he realized that he had been the one who didn't belong. The luxury sedan purred as Ethan turned the key in the ignition, feeling the powerful engine roar to life beneath him. The weight of the keys in his hand was more than just metal. It was a symbol of years of hard work, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in himself. But just as he prepared to drive off, something made him pause. He turned his gaze toward the glass walls of the dealership, where he caught sight of Greg and Ryan standing stiffly near Mr. Harrington. Their faces were pale, their hands clasped tightly behind their backs. Ethan could have driven away, let them stew in their embarrassment. But something inside him told him that this moment wasn't over yet. There was something left unsaid, unfinished. Taking a deep breath, he shut off the engine, pocketed the keys, and stepped out of the car. All eyes in the dealership turned to him as he walked back inside. Greg shifted uncomfortably. Ryan shot a quick glance at Mr. Harrington, as if hoping for an escape. Ethan stopped a few feet from them, folding his arms. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "when I walked in here today, I knew people might judge me based on how I looked. It's happened before. But what I didn't expect was just how quickly you two dismissed me, how easily you assumed I was worthless." Greg cleared his throat. "Listen, man, it was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, Greg, it wasn't. It was a choice you made the moment you saw me." Silence stretched between them. The other employees in the showroom stood still, watching the confrontation unfold like an unfolding drama. Mr. Harrington stepped forward, his sharp gaze never leaving his employees. "Ethan is absolutely right." He turned to Greg and Ryan. "And now, I'd like to know, do you both understand the weight of your actions?" Greg opened his mouth, hesitated, then shut it. Ryan, however, exhaled sharply and crossed his arms. "Look, I get it. We messed up. But we were just doing what we thought was best for the dealership." Mr. Harrington's eyes darkened. "Best for the dealership?" His voice was dangerously low. "You mean to tell me that disrespecting a hardworking man who came in as a legitimate customer was your idea of good business?" Ryan flinched. "No, I mean, I just thought—" "You thought," Mr. Harrington cut him off, "that a man's worth is determined by his appearance. That wealth should be obvious, that success only looks a certain way." He let those words sink in before he added, "And that's a mindset I cannot allow in my business." Greg swallowed hard. "Sir, we can learn from this. It won't happen again." Mr. Harrington studied them both for a long, silent moment. Then in a voice firm as steel, he said, "You're right. It won't." A tense pause, and then, "You're both fired." The words sent a shock wave through the room. Ryan's face drained of color. Wait, what? Greg's eyes widened. Sir, please. Mr. Harrington shook his head. You had a chance to treat people with respect, and you failed. You mocked a customer. You embarrassed this dealership. I have no room for that kind of behavior here. Greg looked pleadingly at the other employees, but no one stepped in to help. Ryan clenched his jaw, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. This is ridiculous, Ryan spat. You're choosing him over us? Yes, Mr. Harrington said simply, because he represents what this business should stand for. Hard work, perseverance, and integrity. And you? You represent exactly what's wrong with it. Security was called. Greg and Ryan had no choice but to collect their things and leave, their departure marked by the heavy silence of their stunned co-workers. As Ethan watched them go, he felt no malice, no triumph, just a deep, quiet sense of justice. Mr. Harrington turned to Ethan and extended a hand. I meant what I said earlier. You remind me of someone I used to know, and I can see now you've turned into exactly the kind of person I always knew you could be. Ethan shook his hand firmly. Thank you, he said, not just for the car, but for seeing me for who I really am. Mr. Harrington smiled. And don't be a stranger, son. You've earned your place here, no matter what anyone else might say. Ethan nodded, feeling something in his chest lighten. Then with his head held high, he stepped back into his car, turned the key, and drove off, leaving behind a lesson the dealership would never forget. As Ethan drove out of the dealership, the events of the past hour replayed in his mind. The humiliation, the doubt, the anger, he had felt it all. But in the end, justice had prevailed. The sleek, midnight black sedan moved effortlessly along the road, its engine humming like a symphony of success. Yet it wasn't just the car that made him feel victorious, it was the principle. The truth that he had proven, not just to Greg and Ryan, but to everyone who had ever doubted him. Still, deep down, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. Would Greg and Ryan learn from this? Would they change? Or would they walk away bitter, blaming everyone but themselves? Either way, their actions had consequences. Ethan pulled into a quiet parking lot near the beach, needing a moment to breathe. He stepped out of the car, letting the salty ocean breeze wash over him. For years, he had dreamed of this moment, not just buying a luxury car, but proving to himself that his struggles had been worth it. That despite the years of working late nights, fixing engines, and saving every penny, he could rise above the expectations that society placed on him. He sat on a bench overlooking the waves, lost in thought. Then his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Mr. Harrington, Ethan, I wanted to thank you again for today. You reminded me of why I built this business in the first place. People like you deserve to be seen. I hope you keep proving the world wrong. Ethan smiled. I will, he typed back. But just as he was about to put his phone away, another message came in. This time from a number he hadn't expected. Greg, I don't expect you to care, but I just wanted to say, I get it now. What I did was wrong. Maybe losing this job was the wake-up call I needed. Ethan stared at the message, reading it twice. He wasn't sure if Greg was truly remorseful or if he was just feeling the sting of losing his job. But something in the words felt different, less defensive, more real. Ethan took a deep breath, then replied, change doesn't happen overnight. But if you really mean that, prove it. Not to me, to yourself. Greg didn't reply right away, but Ethan knew that some lessons took time to sink in. The days turned into weeks, and Ethan's life began to shift in unexpected ways. News of what had happened at the dealership spread quickly. A few of Ethan's old friends who had once laughed at his frugal lifestyle now reached out with admiration. I can't believe you actually did it, man, one of them said. You proved everyone wrong. But it wasn't about proving people wrong anymore. It was about showing others, people like him, that they could rise beyond their circumstances. A month later, Ethan received another message. Greg, I took your advice. I applied for a new job at a different dealership. This time I'm doing it right. Thanks for calling me out that day. I needed it. Ethan read the message, a small smile playing at his lips. Some people did change after all. One evening, Ethan found himself driving past his old neighborhood, the tiny apartment where he had spent years scraping by, the auto shop where he had worked until his hands ached. All of it was still there, unchanged. And yet he had changed. He parked outside the shop and stepped inside. The familiar scent of oil and grease hit him instantly, stirring up memories of the past. "Ethan?" He turned to see Tom, his former boss and mentor, the man who had once taught him everything he knew about cars. "Tom," Ethan said, smiling. "It's been a while." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and grinned. "Last I heard, you walked into some fancy dealership and taught them a lesson they'll never forget." Ethan chuckled. Word travels fast. Tom gestured toward Ethan's new car parked outside. "That yours?" Ethan nodded. "Years of saving and hard work." Tom clapped him on the back. "Proud of you, kid. But tell me, what's next?" Ethan hesitated. For so long, buying this car had been the goal. But now, he realized something bigger was calling him. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "I want to help people like me. People who feel like they don't belong in certain spaces just because of how they look. Maybe start a program for young mechanics. Teach them not just about cars, but about confidence, about knowing their worth." Tom's eyes twinkled. "Now that sounds like a real dream." Ethan smiled, because this time, it wasn't just about proving something to himself. It was about lifting others up. As Ethan drove away from the shop that had shaped his journey, he thought about everything that had led him to this moment. How many people out there were just like him? Overlooked, underestimated, dismissed before they even had a chance? If there was one lesson he had learned, it was this. Success isn't about looking the part. It's about never giving up, even when the world tells you that you don't belong. Ethan had walked into that dealership a man judged by his appearance. He walked out a man who changed the way people saw him forever. And to anyone watching this story, wondering if they too have what it takes, you do. All you have to do is believe in yourself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Let's keep proving the world wrong, one success at a time.